When you read a sentence, your brain is doing something incredibly complex. It's translating dark lines on paper into detailed concepts and ideas. The process happens instantly, completely outside your awareness. And for anyone trying to study how the brain works, that raises a massive problem. How exactly do you measure a mind you can't even see? What we consider psychology today, the scientific study of behavior and mental processes, looks very different from how people investigated the mind in the past. To understand how modern science actually works, we have to look at the historical hurdles early thinkers had to clear. For thousands of years, ancient cultures guessed at the nature of human consciousness. Greek philosophers like Plato created theories to explain our behavior, suggesting that our soul, or psyche, was divided into three distinct parts: intellect, desires, and emotions, which constantly needed to be kept in balance. By the 17th century, René Descartes attempted to organize these ideas into mind-body dualism. He argued that the mind is an immaterial substance containing your thoughts and emotions that somehow interacts with the physical, material body through the pineal gland, a tiny structure located deep within the brain. Without a way to physically measure a feeling or quantify a thought, the study of the mind was restricted to the realm of philosophy. It lacked the empirical verification required to join the ranks of the natural sciences. The turning point arrived in 1879, when a German professor named Wilhelm Wundt opened the very first experimental psychology lab at the University of Leipzig. By applying the scientific method to human consciousness, he officially carved psychology out from philosophy as its own distinct discipline. This lab gave rise to structuralism. The goal here was to take complex psychological processes and break them down into their most basic, fundamental elements, mapping the structures of the mind the same way a chemist might map the periodic table. To find these elements, they used a method called introspection. Researchers would ask human subjects to perform a mental task, like reading a book or solving a math equation, and then have them describe their exact conscious experiences while doing it. The problem is, human beings are terrible witnesses to their own cognition. When you solve a math problem, you can't accurately describe the invisible background processing your brain does to arrive at the answer. A lot of mental work happens entirely outside of our conscious awareness. Recognizing this flaw, a rival school of thought emerged called functionalism. They abandoned the idea of breaking the mind down into static parts entirely. Instead, they argued that human consciousness is a continuous, constantly changing process. So rather than asking how the mind works, functionalists started asking why it does what it does. They shifted their focus to observing how humans behave in their environments, asking why we form relationships or experience specific emotions. By changing the questions they were asking, early researchers realized they needed new ways to collect data. This set off a scramble across the scientific community to discover a definitive method for testing human behavior. Around the turn of the 20th century, neurologist Sigmund Freud pushed the focus aggressively back toward the hidden mind. He developed psychoanalysis, prioritizing the heavy influence of buried childhood memories and completely unconscious thoughts on our daily actions. Freud divided the psyche into three forces: the id, representing primitive instincts, the ego, grounded in reality, and the superego, acting as our moral conscience. According to this model, human behavior is the ego finding a middle ground between our desires and morals. But Freud's system shared the exact same flaw as early philosophy. The id, ego, and superego are purely theoretical constructs. Because they are completely unobservable, they can't be scientifically tested, verified, or measured. Frustration with these untestable theories fueled a massive backlash in the early 20th century, known as behaviorism. These new researchers wanted a strictly empirical science, so they decided to completely ignore the unmeasurable internal mind. The physiologist Ivan Pavlov demonstrated this with his famous dogs, pioneering classical conditioning. By ringing a bell right before feeding time, he measured how the dogs learned through pure repetition. Eventually, the animals would physically salivate at the sound of the bell alone. Learning was quantified strictly through physical anticipation, without ever probing what the dog was actually thinking. Behaviorism gave psychology the strict scientific measurement it had been searching for, but the cost was high. It artificially erased conscious thought and feeling from the equation, resulting in a fractured science that desperately needed a compromise. In the 1960s, cognitive psychology emerged to bridge the divide between the mind and action. By treating mental processes like memory and judgment as measurable stages of information processing, researchers finally brought the study of internal thoughts back into the scientific fold. This shift was solidified by the arrival of brain imaging technology. Tools like the MRI allow scientists to see precisely which regions of the brain are active during specific mental tasks, providing a direct physical link between an internal thought and a measurable biological event. With the measurement problem solved, today's psychologists rarely lock themselves into rigid historical camps like structuralism or behaviorism. Instead, they use these tools to branch out into highly specialized research fields, like developmental psychology, tracking how cognition changes over a lifetime, or social psychology, analyzing how groups influence our decisions. By finding a way to measure the invisible, psychology evolved from speculative ancient philosophy into a hard empirical science. And with that foundation finally built, we have the tools we need to uncover exactly what our minds are doing behind the scenes.